I came home from deployment expecting quiet. My ranch had always been the one place where nothing changed. Open pasture. Wind moving across the grass. A long dirt road that ended at my gate. But the morning after I got back, I drove out there and saw something I'd never seen before. 3 excavators, a trenching machine, and a line of massive steel water pipes stacked along the edge of my field. For a moment I thought they were in the wrong place. Then I saw the trench. It ran straight across my pasture, almost 300 feet long, cutting my land in half like someone had taken a knife to it. Workers were already lowering the first section of pipe into the ground. I stepped out of my truck and asked the supervisor what they were doing on my property. He didn't argue. He didn't hesitate. He just pointed to a document on his clipboard and said, "HOA approved a water pipeline across this land while you were overseas." A few minutes later, the HOA president pulled up in her SUV. She looked at the trench, then at me, and said something I won't forget. "Sergeant, you've been gone a long time. The community had to move forward." The pipeline project alone was worth nearly $3 million. And according to the paperwork they were holding, my land was already part of it. But as I stood there looking at that trench across my ranch, one thing about their documents felt very wrong. So I started taking pictures. Because if they really had permission to dig through my land, why wasn't there a single easement filed with the county? Before we continue, if you enjoy stories where patience, law, and quiet strategy expose the truth, consider subscribing. On this channel we follow real-style conflicts where power is challenged the right way, not with shouting, but with the one document that changes everything. Before that trench ever appeared on my land, my ranch had been quiet for years. My name is Daniel Mercer, and for most of my adult life I've served in the Army working logistics deployments overseas. My job has always been about systems, moving supplies, tracking equipment, making sure every decision is backed by paperwork and a chain of command. That mindset followed me everywhere, even back home. The ranch sits about 15 minutes outside a small town called Red Hollow, surrounded by rolling pasture and scattered oak trees. My father bought the land decades ago, long before the subdivision started creeping toward the countryside. To most people, it's just acreage. To me, it's the one place that never moved while the rest of my life did. When my father passed away, the ranch became mine. I kept it simple, no development, no businesses. Just open land, a small house, and a long gravel driveway that disappears into the hills. For years, nothing much changed around there. But about 3 years before my last deployment, a new homeowners association formed in the neighboring subdivision down the road. At first, they handled the usual things: community maintenance, landscaping rules, neighborhood signage. Then slowly, their focus started shifting. New board members came in. New committees formed. And the meetings started including words like infrastructure expansion and community development partnerships. The president of the board was a woman named Margaret Holloway. Margaret had a background in real estate development, and she ran the HOA meetings like business briefings. She always had charts, proposals, and long explanations about improving property values for the community. The first time I met her was at a neighborhood meeting before I left for deployment. She mentioned that the county was exploring upgrades to the regional water system. Some developers nearby were planning new housing projects, and they would eventually need additional water capacity. At the time, it sounded like something that would stay on paper for years. Still, I made one thing clear before I deployed. My ranch was not part of any community land corridor. There were no shared access agreements, no infrastructure easements, and no reason for anyone to cross that property without my permission. Margaret nodded politely and said the HOA respected private property rights. And for a while, that seemed to be the end of it. But several months into my overseas deployment, something changed back home. Because while I was halfway across the world, the HOA board started discussing a water pipeline route. And the fastest path to the new development ran straight through my ranch. The trench across my ranch wasn't a rumor. It was real. By the time I finished talking to the construction supervisor, the machines were already moving again. Another section of pipe was being lowered into the ground, and the trenching machine kept carving a deeper line straight across the pasture. I asked the supervisor one simple question. "Who gave you permission to dig here?" He didn't look nervous. He didn't argue. He just flipped open a folder on his clipboard and showed me the authorization page. At the top was the contractor's company name. Below that was a document titled Community Infrastructure Approval. And at the bottom of the page was the signature of the HOA president, Margaret Holloway. According to the document, the Homeowners Association had approved a water pipeline corridor that crossed my property. The paperwork claimed the project had been discussed during multiple board meetings while I was deployed overseas. The supervisor tapped the signature and shrugged. "This was all cleared months ago," he said. "We're just following the approved route." I read through the page carefully. There was a contractor authorization. There was a board vote summary. But something important was missing. There was no county easement number anywhere on the document. Anyone who deals with land infrastructure knows the difference between an approval and a legal right-of-way. A project like this couldn't legally cross private land without a recorded easement. I asked the supervisor if the county had filed one. He didn't know. He said the HOA handled the access approval and the contractors simply followed the project map. About 20 minutes later, a white SUV pulled up near the equipment. Margaret Holloway stepped out. She looked at the trench, then at me standing beside it. Her tone was calm, almost casual. "Sergeant Mercer," she said. "I heard you were back." Then she gestured toward the pipeline trench running across my land. "You've been overseas a long time," she added. The community had to move forward. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just took out my phone and started photographing the trench, the equipment numbers, and the documents on the supervisor's clipboard. Because if the HOA really had the authority to dig a water pipeline through my ranch, there should have been a county easement on record. And if there wasn't, then someone had made a very expensive mistake. The machines didn't stop after that conversation. By the time the sun was overhead, the trench had already stretched deeper into my ranch. Workers moved with the kind of efficiency that comes from following a schedule that's already been approved. To them, this was just another infrastructure job. Another line on a project map. But to me, every foot of trench meant someone believed they had the legal right to cross my land. And I still hadn't seen a single document that proved it. That afternoon I drove into town and stopped at the county clerk's office. The building was quiet, just a few people waiting in line and the soft sound of printers behind the counters. I filled out a records request for my property parcel and asked the clerk to search for any utility easements registered against the ranch. The clerk typed for a moment, scrolling through the county database. Then she shook her head. "There aren't any," she said. I asked her to check again. Pipeline easements, water authority access, infrastructure corridors, anything connected to the parcel number. She ran the search twice. Same result. No easements filed. No infrastructure access granted. Nothing that allowed a pipeline across my property. I asked for a printed copy confirming the search results, and she handed me a stamped document showing exactly what the county records contained. Which, at that moment, was nothing. While I was still standing at the counter, my phone buzzed. It was an email from the HOA. The subject line read, "Compliance Notice." I opened the attachment and read it slowly. The board claimed that my behavior at the construction site earlier that morning had interfered with an approved community infrastructure project. Because of that, they were issuing a $1,500 compliance penalty. The letter also warned that any attempt to delay the construction could expose the community to contractor damages, which the HOA would hold me financially responsible for. I read the letter twice. Then I noticed something else attached to the email. A message from the HOA's legal representative. It stated that the water pipeline project was valued at nearly $2.8 million, and that interference with the project schedule could create losses exceeding $75,000 per day. In other words, they weren't just confident. They were betting everything on their paperwork. When I drove back to the ranch that evening, the trench had grown even longer. Survey flags stretched across the pasture in a straight line, marking where the rest of the pipeline would go. Workers were already preparing the next section of pipe. By the time the project finished, the trench would run almost the entire width of my property. I stood there for a few minutes watching the machines move across the field. Then I took out my phone and sent a formal written request to the HOA board. Just one question. Please provide the official county easement filing number authorizing pipeline construction across parcel 17-04. I sent the message and waited. Because if the project was really approved, the board should have been able to send that document in less than 5 minutes. But 2 days passed, and the HOA still hadn't sent the easement number. Instead, another letter arrived, and this one made the situation much worse. 2 days after I asked the HOA for the easement filing number, another letter arrived. This one wasn't polite. The subject line read, "Second compliance violation." According to the board, my request for documentation and my presence at the construction site was now being classified as continued interference with a community infrastructure project. The new penalty amount listed in the letter was $7,500. They also included a warning. If I continued to question the project or attempt to stop construction, the HOA would pursue additional fines and legal recovery for any delays caused to the contractor. In other words, the numbers were starting to climb. That same afternoon, another email came from the board announcing a special HOA meeting to discuss the water pipeline project. The meeting would be open to residents. The subject line said it clearly. Community Infrastructure Update. When I arrived that evening, the room was already full. Neighbors from the subdivision sat in folding chairs while the HOA board arranged documents and project diagrams across a table at the front. Margaret Holloway stood beside a large map mounted on an easel. The map showed the entire pipeline route from the county water system to a new housing development several miles away. And right in the middle of the map was a straight red line cutting directly across my ranch. Margaret began the meeting by explaining that the community had been working for months to support regional water expansion. She described the pipeline as a major infrastructure improvement that would support future growth and increase property values in the surrounding area. Then she addressed the problem. Unfortunately, she said, one property owner has recently begun questioning the project. She didn't say my name, but everyone in the room knew who she meant. Margaret explained that the HOA board had already voted to approve the pipeline corridor while I was overseas. She added that the owner had not participated in the community planning process and was now attempting to disrupt progress after the project had already begun. Several neighbors nodded. From their perspective, the project looked official. There were contractors. There were permits posted on the equipment. And the HOA board was presenting it as something the community needed. Then Margaret mentioned the fines. She explained that penalties had been issued to the property owner for interfering with the project and warned that continued resistance could create financial liability for the entire community. When she finished speaking, she opened the floor for questions. I stood up slowly from the back row. The room went quiet. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I asked one question. Could the board provide the county easement filing number authorizing construction across parcel 17-04? Margaret didn't hesitate. She simply replied that the HOA board vote had approved the corridor and that the project had already been authorized through community governance. Then she moved on to the next question. But something about that answer told me everything I needed to know. Because if the HOA vote really was enough to approve a pipeline across private land, then the county wouldn't require easements at all. And yet every infrastructure project in the county record still had one. Which meant one of two things had to be true. Either the easement existed somewhere no one had shown me yet, Or the HOA had approved a multi-million-dollar pipeline across land they never actually had the legal right to use. That night I parked my truck at the edge of the ranch and sat there for a long time watching the construction lights across the field. Even after sunset, the crews were still working. Portable floodlights lit up the trench, turning the pasture into something that looked more like an industrial site than the land I grew up on. Workers moved around the machines while another section of pipe was lowered into the ground. The project was moving fast. Faster than most legal challenges ever could. For a moment, I considered the possibility that I was already too late. The HOA had lawyers. The contractors had permits. And every day the trench grew longer across my property. By the time the pipeline was finished, the damage would already be done. But one thing about the entire situation kept bothering me. In the Army, logistics operations run on documents. Every movement of equipment, every transfer of authority, every change in a mission route, there's always a chain of approval behind it. And the larger the operation, the more paperwork exists. This pipeline project wasn't small. The contractor's documents said it was worth nearly $3 million. Projects that size don't move without layers of authorization. County engineering permits. Utility approvals. Recorded easements. Right-of-way filings. But after 2 days of searching, I still hadn't found the one document that mattered most. The easement that legally allowed that pipeline to cross my land. The HOA kept avoiding that question. They talked about board votes. They talked about community authority. But they never once mentioned the county record. I looked out across the field again, watching the excavator drop another section of pipe into the trench. If the easement really existed, they would have shown it already. And if it didn't, then every foot of pipe they were laying into the ground was building a project that should never have been there in the first place. The next letter from the HOA arrived 3 days later. This one wasn't just a penalty notice. It was a legal warning. According to the document, the HOA board had now classified my actions as continued interference with an approved infrastructure project. Because the construction had already begun, they claimed that any attempt to challenge the project could expose the community to major financial losses. And those losses, the letter said, would be my responsibility. The new penalty total listed in the notice was $18,500. But that number wasn't the real threat. Attached to the letter was a second document from the HOA's attorney. It stated that if the fines remained unpaid, the board would begin the process of placing a property lien against the ranch. If the dispute continued, the case could move to court. And if the HOA won, the property itself could eventually face forced recovery actions to pay the penalties. In other words, the numbers were climbing quickly. Meanwhile, construction on the pipeline didn't slow down. By the end of that week, the trench stretched nearly the entire width of the ranch. Workers had already begun installing the deeper pipe sections, and concrete forms were being prepared for the pump station foundation near the property line. From the outside, it looked like the project was already decided. The pipeline was almost finished. The HOA had lawyers backing their position. And the fines against me were growing fast enough to create serious financial pressure. Even some neighbors had started assuming the outcome. To them, the situation looked simple. The HOA had approved the project. The contractors had permits. And the property owner was now fighting something that was already halfway built. For the first time since I returned home, it actually looked like the HOA might win. But there was still one thing they had never shown anyone. The one document that would prove the project had the legal right to cross my land. And the longer they avoided that document, the more certain I became that it didn't exist at all. Late that night, I was still sitting at my kitchen table going through the construction documents again. By that point, I had read the contractor permit at least 10 times. Most of it looked routine: project number, contractor license, county inspection schedule. But near the bottom of the permit page there was a small line that caught my attention. It referenced something called a Community Infrastructure Corridor designation. That phrase wasn't the same thing as an easement. So the next morning I went back to the county records office and asked the clerk about it. She pulled up the engineering database and searched for the corridor designation listed on the permit. After a few seconds, the file appeared on her screen. It was real. The county had approved an infrastructure corridor months earlier as part of the regional water expansion project. But when she opened the map attached to the approval, something immediately stood out. The corridor was drawn across several properties owned by the HOA subdivision. It followed the edge of their development land for nearly half a mile. Then it stopped. Right at the boundary where the subdivision ended. Right where my ranch began. I asked the clerk to zoom in on the map. She traced the line carefully with the cursor and confirmed what I was seeing. The approved corridor never crossed my parcel. My land wasn't included in the designation at all, which meant to permit the contractors were using only authorized construction up to the edge of the HOA property, not across my ranch. In other words, the pipeline route the HOA approved wasn't just missing an easement. It wasn't inside the approved infrastructure corridor either. And that meant the moment the trench crossed my property line, the entire project had stepped outside the permit. The moment I saw that corridor map, the situation finally started to make sense. For days the HOA had been talking about approvals, board votes, and community authority. They kept acting like the project was completely legitimate. But the county map told a different story. The approved infrastructure corridor stopped exactly where the HOA property ended, which meant the pipeline was legally allowed to reach the boundary of the subdivision, and nowhere beyond it. My ranch had never been included in the approval. So the next question was obvious. How had the project crossed my property line in the first place? I spent the rest of that afternoon reviewing every document the contractors had posted at the construction site. The permit number, the engineering authorization, the contractor license. Everything pointed back to the same county infrastructure approval. But the moment the trench crossed my land, the project was no longer inside the corridor that permit was based on, which meant someone had made a decision to continue the route without legal authorization. And the only people claiming to have approved that decision were the HOA board. That night I called the Military Legal Assistance Office connected to the base where my unit operated. I wasn't asking them to fight the HOA. I just needed to confirm something. Because one detail about the timeline kept standing out. The HOA vote approving the pipeline corridor across my land had happened while I was deployed overseas. When the legal officer on the phone heard that, he asked a few simple questions. Had I received a certified notice about the project while deployed? Had the HOA attempted to contact me directly before approving construction on the land? Had any court or county authority authorized the project in my absence? The answer to all three questions was the same. No. The legal officer paused for a moment. Then he mentioned something that immediately shifted the entire situation. The Service Members Civil Relief Act, often called the SCRA. Most people think the law only applies to things like loans or housing payments. But the SCRA also protects deployed service members from certain legal actions affecting their property while they are on active duty. Major property decisions, especially ones involving liens, court actions, or land access, require additional legal safeguards if the owner is deployed. In many cases, courts must be involved before those actions can move forward. Which meant something very important. If the HOA approved construction affecting my land while I was deployed, and did so without direct notice or legal review, that approval could be invalid under federal protections. I spent the next day assembling every document connected to the project. The county corridor map, the contractor permit, the HOA meeting summary showing the vote that approved the pipeline route, my deployment record confirming I had been stationed overseas at the time. Then I added the one thing the HOA had never provided, the missing easement. Because according to the county records, that document simply didn't exist. When the full document packet was finished, it showed three very clear problems. First, the approved infrastructure corridor stopped at the HOA property line. Second, there was no recorded easement allowing the pipeline to cross my ranch. And third, the HOA had approved the route while the property owner was on active military deployment without providing direct notice or legal review. In other words, the board had tried to solve a $3 million infrastructure problem with a community vote. But that vote didn't override county land records. And it definitely didn't override federal protections for deployed service members. The next morning, I delivered the entire packet to the County Infrastructure Enforcement Office. The clerk reviewed the documents quietly for several minutes. Then she picked up the phone and called the county engineering department. An hour later, a supervisor walked out of the back office and asked me a few questions about the construction site. When I explained where the trench currently ran across the ranch, his expression changed slightly. Because by that point the pipeline wasn't just near the property line anymore. It had already crossed hundreds of feet into land that had never been legally approved for the project. The supervisor flipped through the documents again. Then he circled the corridor map with his pen. "You're saying the excavation is already past this boundary?" I nodded. He closed the folder slowly. "All right," he said. Then he reached for his phone again and called the County Inspection Division. Because if the pipeline construction had crossed outside the approved corridor, and if there was no easement authorizing it, then the project currently digging through my ranch wasn't just controversial. It was unauthorized infrastructure construction. And that was something the county took very seriously. Before I left the office, the supervisor told me one more thing. They were sending inspectors to the construction site. Soon. And once they arrived, someone was going to have to explain how a pipeline worth nearly $3 million ended up being built across land that was never legally approved for the project in the first place. 2 days after I delivered the documents to the county office, the construction crews were back on my ranch early in the morning. By then the trench stretched almost completely across the pasture. Sections of pipe had already been welded together, and workers were preparing the ground near the property line where the pump station foundation was supposed to go. From a distance, the project looked finished. Like the pipeline had already won. Around mid-morning, a white county inspection truck pulled onto the dirt road leading toward the trench. Then a second vehicle followed. The construction supervisor noticed them immediately. Within minutes the machine slowed down and the equipment operators climbed down from their cabs. The county inspector stepped out holding a clipboard and walked straight toward the trench line. The contractor met him halfway. They shook hands, exchanged a few quiet words, and then the inspector asked to see the project permits and authorization documents. The supervisor handed him the same folder I had seen the first day I returned home. The inspector flipped through the pages slowly. Contractor license. Project permit. Engineering authorization. Everything looked routine until he reached the corridor approval page. Then he stopped. He looked at the map attached to the permit and turned toward the trench stretching across my ranch. "Where exactly is the property line?" he asked. The supervisor pointed toward a line of survey stakes a few hundred feet behind them. The inspector walked over, steadied the markers, and then looked back toward the trench that was already cut into my pasture. Then he asked the question the contractors clearly weren't expecting. "Where is the easement authorization for the land past this boundary?" The supervisor hesitated. He flipped back through the folder again. Then he pointed to the HOA approval document. "The Homeowners Association approved the pipeline corridor through the area," he explained. A few minutes later another vehicle arrived. Margaret Holloway stepped out of her SUV and walked toward the inspector with the same confident posture she had used at the HOA meeting. She explained that the board had approved the route months earlier and that the project was part of a regional infrastructure improvement. The inspector listened quietly. Then he held up the corridor map. "This authorization," he said, "stops at the subdivision boundary." Margaret tried to explain that the HOA had extended the corridor through a board vote. The inspector shook his head slightly. "An HOA vote doesn't create a legal easement," he said. By then several neighbors had gathered near the fence line watching the conversation. The contractor looked uneasy. The inspector turned back toward the trench and asked another question. How far has the pipeline already been installed past the corridor boundary? The supervisor checked his notes. Approximately 600 feet, he said. The inspector wrote something on his clipboard. Then he turned to Margaret again. Do you have a recorded county easement for that section of land? For the first time since I had met her, Margaret hesitated. She started explaining the board's vote again. The inspector interrupted her calmly. Community governance doesn't authorize excavation on private property. Then he asked one final question. Was the property owner notified before the board approved the route? Margaret glanced in my direction. The inspector followed her gaze and saw me standing near the fence. I walked over and handed him the document packet I had already submitted to the county office. He flipped through the pages. My deployment record. The corridor approval map. The missing easement search confirmation from the county clerk. When he reached the last page, he looked up again. So the vote happened while you were deployed overseas? He asked. I nodded. The inspector closed the folder slowly. Then the situation is even more complicated than I thought, he said. Margaret tried to protest. She explained that the community needed the pipeline and that construction delays would cost the contractor thousands of dollars per day. The inspector didn't argue. He simply pointed back toward the trench cutting across the ranch. That may be true, he said. But the law still requires a valid easement before you dig. Margaret insisted the board believed their approval was enough. That was when I finally spoke. I kept my voice calm. I looked directly at the inspector, then at Margaret. And I said the only sentence that mattered. Your vote approved a project, but it never approved my land. For a moment the entire construction site was silent. The inspector wrote a few more notes on his clipboard. Then he turned toward the construction supervisor. Shut the equipment down, he said. Until this project has a legal easement and corrected authorization, no further work happens on this property. The excavators stopped. The workers stepped away from the trench. And the pipeline project that had been racing across my ranch for the past week suddenly came to a complete stop. But the real decision about what would happen next was still about to be made. The moment the inspector ordered the machines shut down, the entire construction site changed. A few minutes earlier, the trench had been full of noise, engines running, welders sparking, trucks moving along the dirt road. Now everything was quiet. Workers stepped away from the equipment while the county inspector continued reviewing the project documents with the contractor. Margaret Holloway stood a few yards away watching the conversation unfold. For the first time since this whole situation started, she didn't look confident. Because at that point the issue wasn't just about a disagreement with the HOA anymore. It had become a county infrastructure violation. The inspector spoke with the construction supervisor for several minutes, confirming exactly how far the pipeline had been installed past the corridor boundary. The number was worse than anyone expected. Nearly 600 feet of trench had been dug across my ranch. Sections of pipe were already welded together underground, and part of the foundation work for the pump station had started near the property line. In other words, the project had gone far beyond a simple mistake. The contractor had already built a large portion of the pipeline across land that had never been legally approved for construction. The inspector made a call to the county engineering office to confirm the corridor map and permit conditions. When he finished the call, he walked back toward the group. Until a legal easement is recorded, he said, this section of the project cannot continue. Then he added something that made the contractor's expression change immediately. Because excavation has already occurred without proper authorization, the site will also require restoration review. That meant the trench across my ranch couldn't simply be left in place while the legal situation was sorted out. If the project couldn't obtain a valid easement, and there was no reason I would grant one, then the construction company would have to restore the land to its original condition. Which meant removing the pipe, filling the trench, and repairing the pasture. The inspector also addressed the HOA penalties that had been issued against me. Once the county confirmed that the pipeline construction had extended outside the approved corridor and lacked a valid easement, the HOA's claim that I was interfering with a legitimate project collapsed. Those fines had been based entirely on the assumption that the HOA had the authority to approve the route. They didn't. Within a few days, the HOA's legal office sent a new letter. The previous penalties were being withdrawn. The lien warning was canceled. And the board acknowledged that the infrastructure route had been approved under incorrect assumptions about jurisdiction and property authority. But the consequences didn't stop there. The county infrastructure office required the contractor to submit a revised route plan for the pipeline. The new plan would follow the original corridor through HOA-owned land and then divert around my ranch entirely. That reroute would add additional cost and time to the project. But legally, it was the only option left. Meanwhile, the trench that had cut across my pasture for the past week slowly disappeared. Over the next several days, construction crews returned, not to install more pipe, but to remove what they had already placed underground. Sections of steel pipeline were lifted back out of the trench. The soil was filled back in. Heavy equipment leveled the ground and reseeded the damaged sections of the field. By the end of the week, the long scar that had divided the ranch began to fade. The pipeline project moved forward again. But this time, it moved somewhere else. A few weeks later, the ranch looked almost the way it had before I came home. The trench that once cut across the pasture had been filled and leveled. Fresh grass seed had started to grow where the excavation had been, and the equipment tracks that once marked the field slowly faded under the wind and rain. The pipeline project didn't disappear. It simply moved. The county approved a revised route that stayed inside the original infrastructure corridor and then curved around my property instead of crossing it. It took longer. It cost more. But this time it followed the law. The HOA board stopped mentioning the pipeline after that. A few members quietly stepped down from their positions over the following months, and the meetings became a lot quieter than they used to be. As for me, I went back to the same routine the ranch had always known. Early mornings, long quiet evenings, and the same stretch of open land that had been there long before the pipeline project ever appeared. Because in the end, the biggest mistake the HOA made wasn't trying to build the pipeline. It was assuming that a vote could replace the one document the law actually required.